Hey everyone, welcome to Musical Musing, the channel where I discuss and analyze musicals from both stage and screen. So today, I don't want to talk about a single musical, I want to talk about an entire genre, the Disney musical. And if there's one thing that almost all Disney musicals have in common, it's their villains. Oftentimes, Disney villains are the most memorable part of a Disney film, to the point where they really outshine the heroes in terms of popularity. And a trend that I've noticed both in myself and among a lot of other Disney fans is that as people grow older, they tend to view these villains very differently. When I was little, Scar throwing Mufasa off a cliff was this sad and frightening thing. Watching The Little Mermaid, Ursula seemed really scary and intimidating. But now, Ursula is the most relatable character in that movie. She seems like she'd be fun to go out and have a few cocktails with. The same thing goes for so many of the other villains. They're just fun characters. Scar and Tamatoa and Yzma and Hades. The list just goes on and on. These villains are not only a lot of fun, but they're also interesting. Besides that, I find that really the older I get, the more sympathetic these characters seem. And that's certainly not unique to me. I've seen plenty of other Disney fans express the exact same thing. And if you look at fan-created content that deals with these characters, they're often portrayed in a much more sympathetic light than they are in the source material. I was a huge Lion King nerd when I was a kid, and the amount of art and comics I saw that shows Scar's dad hitting him and giving him his scar is off the charts. So why do people relate to these characters, specifically as they get older? For me, this really boils down to the fact that in Disney films, the villains very often seem to be oppressed by some existing power structure. To explain what I mean, let's look at Scar again. The film confirms that he's Mufasa's brother.
Why, if it isn't my big brother?
But heavily implies that Mufasa gets to be king for the sole reason that he was born before Scar.
Well, I was first in line, until the little hairball was born.
And, that hardly seems fair. It's also implied that Scar is naturally weak, maybe because he's the runt of the litter.
Well, as far as brains go, I got the lion's share, but when it comes to brute strength, I'm afraid I'm at the shallow end of the gene pool.
So he's sort of got everything going against him. He's the underdog, or underlion, I guess. And it's really easy to root for an underdog, especially when you're a teenager or young adult struggling in a difficult economy and in an unstable socio-political environment. And on that same note, what does Scar really want to do? Ultimately, he wants to be king, at least partially so he can bring the hyenas into the Pride Lands. We're shown that this is a bad thing because literally everything in the Pride Lands dies once the hyenas come in, but we're never really given a reason as to why this is. Hyenas don't cause droughts, so the idea that the hyenas would throw the ecosystem out of balance is at least partially an invention of this film. What is this implying? That outsiders integrating into a community is bad?
What about that shadowy place?
That's beyond our borders. You must never go there, Simba.
Because that sounds awfully similar to the arguments that allowed for things like segregation and much of the current discussion around how dangerous immigrants are. Now, am I reading way too much into a Disney movie? Yeah, absolutely, but I'm only doing it to make a larger point. We are shown that Scar is bad because he does things like kill his brother and because everyone suffers when he becomes king. That resonates with us emotionally when we're kids, and so we view him as scary and evil. But as we get older and can look at this film from a more logical, objective perspective, it starts to become more unclear why exactly is he evil. Why is it inherently evil to want to disrupt a monarchy with unfair rules?
Life's not fair, is it?
Why is it evil to want to try to help outsiders and integrate them into your community? And is it really so good that the monarchy is restored in the end of the film? It's really not just Scar who raises these questions either. Many, even the majority of Disney villains do. Let's take a look at Hades. He's surprisingly similar to Scar in a lot of ways, with a powerful older brother, Zeus in this case. And it's made pretty clear through the dialogue that it was Zeus's decision to make Hades work in the underworld, a job that Hades really doesn't like.
But unlike you gods lounging about up here, I regrettably have a full-time gig that you, by the way, so charitably bestowed on me, Zeus.
And pretty much all of his animosity towards Zeus and his jealousy towards Hercules seems to come from this. So again, we've got a character who is, at least in some way, the victim of an oppressive system. Zeus is in charge, he gets to make all the rules, and that includes giving his brother a crappy job dealing with dead people. So again, not only does Hades kind of have reasonable motivation, but it's also motivation that resonates with a lot of dissatisfied adults who grew up with these movies. And the trend continues. Let's take Ursula from The Little Mermaid. She also exists under a pretty strict power structure, another monarchy in this case. And it's less clear here if or why she was ostracized, but it doesn't really matter that much.
Banished and exiled and practically starving.
She's this outspoken woman who's confident in herself and in her body.
And don't underestimate the importance of body language.
And she literally gets labeled as a witch. So it's no wonder why people, especially female fans, have issues demonizing her and instead relate to her on some level. I could go on, but I think the point is pretty clear. Disney's brand being so intertwined with princes and princesses means that there's often a monarchy or some equivalent power structure in many of their films. And although this power structure is almost always shown as benevolent, looking at it objectively, it's often pretty strict. The villains are nearly always posed in opposition to this power structure, and they often suffer under it. It's hard to hate these villains because, more often than not, villains in real life come from within power structures. They're the oppressors, not the oppressed. Maybe they're leaders who abuse their power or something along those lines. And Disney certainly has that type of villain as well, although not very many. Judge Frollo is perhaps the clearest example, and he's one of the villains who's usually considered the most realistic and receives the least amount of sympathy. For the most part, though, Disney villains are kind of oppressed, and this opens a whole other can of worms. Plenty of people have made videos on this topic, so I won't talk about it for too long, but we at least need to touch on queer coding. Because on top of everything else I've mentioned, Disney villains are kind of fabulous.
Oh, I shall practice my curtsy.
Now, to give a brief definition, queer coding occurs when a character exhibits traits that are stereotypically associated with the queer community. In Disney's case, this is almost always gay men, and yet it's never explicitly stated that they're queer. Ursula's design is literally based on a drag queen. Hades is absolutely your sassy gay best friend.
He's honest and he's sweet.
Please.
He would never do anything to hurt me.
He's a guy.
You get the picture. When you put this in the larger context of these villains often being pitted against power structures, the image of them as an oppressed minority fighting against the powers that be becomes even clearer. And it also becomes increasingly troubling that Disney is villainizing these characters. In fact, Disney seems to have backed off this trend somewhat in recent years. They've widened their scope beyond princess films, and their villains have become sort of less iconic and more ambiguous. The more archetypal villains that they do make these days, like Mother Gothel, do tend to be in a position of power rather than the other way around. But that doesn't mean this pattern has gone away. It really hasn't. Let's take a look at Moana, a film which doesn't really seem to have a clear villain, but Tamatoa probably comes the closest. And I mean, he is flamboyant, But he's the most powerful creature in his part of the ocean. No one is oppressing him, right? Well, let's just listen to the first couple lines of his song.
Well, Terminator hasn't always been this glam. I was a drab little crab once. Now I know I can be happy as a clam because I'm beautiful, baby.
He used to be drab, but now he's happy because he stopped hiding and made himself shiny. That sounds awfully like a metaphor for someone coming out of the closet and being happier once they reveal and accept their identity. But once again, this behavior gets villainized. So why does this persist? Why, even as Disney becomes increasingly progressive, do they continue to play into these stereotypes? And why are they still reinforcing that someone being weak or effeminate or a confident woman means that they're evil? I really don't think Disney has ill intent here. I think they continue to do this because it's easy. Fans, including their many queer fans, love and relate to these characters, and we've sort of co-opted them because it's the only representation we've got. It doesn't so much matter that the narrative tells us they're evil, because what we see is that they're almost always the most engaging, memorable, interesting characters on screen. And that's a problem, because Disney sees that their queer audience will continue to watch and enjoy these characters. And by continuing to code characters as queer rather than outright stating that they are, and by making those characters the villains, they can keep their also very large conservative audience happy. That's why we get dozens of press releases about how live-action LeFou is gay, but we only get a single shot in the film that ambiguously confirms it. Disney has realized that they can sort of have their cake and eat it too. This is going to continue until Disney no longer sees it as beneficial. Until there's a louder call for representation, Disney is going to stay in this safe zone that they've found. This is ultimately a conservative company, and I mean that in the very literal sense of the word. From the beginning, a large number of their films have dealt with preserving the status quo. The prince and princess get married, the monarchy stays intact, and they happily rule over their kingdom. I do believe Disney is beginning to change, and they're certainly capable of changing more. I think it's going to be interesting as the consumers demanding change grow louder and louder, what sort of stories Disney will tell in the future. Disney itself is a huge power within the entertainment industry, and they have the ability, and I think the responsibility, to push positive change in the industry. And maybe someday the hyenas and lions coexisting might just be seen as a good thing. This is Musical Musing, signing off.